All right. I don't know why I got that tune with the Stone Road back, but Shalawamo. Yeah, shout out, man. I know it's been a long time. Probably been way longer than 40 days and 40 nights since I did this show. Um, I had some things going on. Had a couple of, I guess you could call them life changes and things like that happening or whatnot. Just some personal things going on. Was really trying to get back in the swing of coming back to y'all to do the show, get my mind right to bring you this, what I feel is knowledge, what I feel is good information. So, first of all, I want to appreciate everybody who supported the show. I will be coming back on my regular time this Friday, hopefully. Well, I ain't gonna even say hopefully. I'm gonna say with a nice little testimony or something that I'm gonna try to do this Friday. But I had to go ahead and do this because I've been holding this one out for a long time. I think it's been the last time I did a show was in June, so we in August now. We always halfway through August right now. So once again, man, I just want to say it's good to be back, man. It's your boy once again, Saul G, aka the Kung Fu Hebrew, coming at you one more time with this information because I got to get back into it. I took a little break because I had to, as I don't know, it's kind of popular now to say you take mental breaks or whatnot, but I had some things going on, and it was difficult for me personally to try to come on here and even just giving information about the topics and the things that I was dealing with was kind of difficult for me to speak on at the time. So I'm back. I'm ready to get into it. I got a really, really good show for you today. Like I said, I'm going to give you a lot of information today. And it's some things you might realize, some things you might not realize. But I got a lot of good information today. And I'm just going to kind of just get right into it. I'm not going to hold or waste no time, man. It's going to be, how I do 30 minutes or less. I think it used to be somebody's pizza slogan back in the day. But I'm not going to hold you too long. Let's go ahead and go full screen. I'm not going to be on camera today. I'm just trying to get it in today. So let's get right into it. Today's is going to be on the law of Moses. Can't even talk right now. The law of Moses versus the apostolic doctrine. What I mean by the apostolic doctrine is basically almost kind of like an Old Testament versus New Testament. The apostolic mean the apostles, the disciples, what they taught. Not necessarily because my last lesson I taught was on what Jesus taught. So we already talked about that. So now we're going to go into what I call what the apostles did. And it's the formation of the church and things like that. So I'm going to get into a lot of those things today. But let's get right into it. All right, man, my opening discussion. And it was something that I had been dealing with, honestly. I probably say since the last time I did a show, man, when the concept of the devil, Lucifer, Satan, right? And it took me a while to kind of like come to this conclusion or to really kind of get things set in my mind about when I say the only devil I see. If you got a mirror, pull out a mirror. You got a camera phone, take a selfie. That's really the only devil I see. People want to talk about, oh, the devil is acting up, the devil this, Satan that. Now, I'm not going to say Satan doesn't exist, but sometimes I think we give him way too much credit because we don't want to take personal accountability. You understand what I'm saying? If I'm out here doing something wrong, if I'm out here doing something I know I'm not supposed to be doing, if I'm participating in activities that I know I'm not supposed to be doing, it's real easy to say, oh, the devil made me do it, right? That's the cliche. Or, oh, the devil is busy today. Or when things ain't going right in your life, your finances and things, like, oh, the devil is busy. Oh, the devil is coming against me right now. It's real easy to sum all those type of things up, right? But the way I look at it is like the only devil I see is the one staring back at me. When I look at a lot of the issues and problems that I had, they were based on personal decisions that I personally made. It wasn't because the devil was influencing me to one way or to the other or to get me in a situation, because once again, we talk about personal responsibility. If there is no personal accountability, how are we ever going to try to move past certain obstacles and things we have in our life, right? If we can't take personal responsibility and accountability for our own actions, and we can just chalk it up to the devil, we can just chalk it up to Lucifer, we can just chalk it up to whatever name you want to call him, Beelzebub, say, doesn't matter. The bottom line is the only devil I see, number one, is the one looking back in the mirror. The other devils that I see are the people around me. And what I mean by the people around me is I am strongly influenced and affected by those in direct contact with me. It's not people on the other side of the earth. It's not people 10,000 miles away. It is people I am in direct contact with. You understand what I'm saying? The people I deal with on a normal everyday basis. These are the devils. When you're on your job and somebody keeps bothering you, or it's like you got a supervisor that always seems like, oh, let me call, and oh, let me send an email, oh, let me go check on them, oh, let me go watch their station. Seems more or less like that devil, that Satan that we're talking about. It seems more concrete because it's tangible. I can say, hey, my supervisor is really trying to come down on me, not the devil is influencing my supervisor. You see what I'm saying? So that is the one thing. And I would just even say, like, in your personal life, who is Satan? And what effect has he had on your life? Now think about it from a standpoint of just growing up. Like, the devil has always been, because it's the one thing I've always noticed, any type of religion, it don't matter what it is. Once it gets organized, you got to have a good guy. You got to have a bad guy. The Avengers got to have a Thanos. The Luke Skywalker got to have a Darth Vader and the Emperor. There's always got to be a good and a bad side. You understand what I'm saying? Because everything can't just kind of focus in this gray area. We got to have hell and the devil and the lake of fire being the bad thing. And if you want the good things, we got God and Jesus and heaven and the angels on this side with the streets of gold. You see what I'm saying? It's always got to be it. And I'm going to get a little bit more into those things a little bit later, but directly. Now, I haven't gotten into that part yet, but I do recognize spirits. I do recognize the existence of other gods. Otherwise, in the Bible, they will say, thou shalt not have no other God before me, right? If there were no existence of other gods, then that statement seems kind of pointless. So I would just ask you personally, like Satan, like, because when I get into it, you'll understand a little bit more I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, Satan putting his hands on you, putting his hands on your life. Go back and analyze, was that Satan or was that just you? You understand what I'm saying? And let me keep moving. All right, I'm gonna get into a little bit of, but your personal study questions are once again, well, not once again, I've asked about what books are not included in the Bible, but this is a different take. What books are spoken about in the Bible but are not included? Like, one would be the book of Gad the seer. Okay, if you go back and you just Google Gad the seer in the Bible Gateway, you'll see they talk about a book. I believe there's also a book of I think Nathan wrote a book. I'm not quite sure, but there's a couple of books that are spoken about but are not in our 66 modern day Bible. And then the last part is the concept of faith, an excuse to remain ignorant. Now, what I mean by that is basically just believing to the point of ignorance. Like, I've been learning something, or I've known something for such a long period of time that I'm just going to keep believing it. Doesn't matter whether or not it's true. Doesn't matter whether or not it makes sense. Doesn't matter even if it's biblical in nature. Doesn't matter if it comes directly from the scriptures, right? Is it just, oh, well, we just got to keep believing it. People who don't have faith, they don't get to the kingdom. You see what I'm saying? So has the concept of faith doesn't mean you don't believe. It's almost like, do you blindly believe just because that's what you're used to? So is the concept of faith an excuse to remain ignorant? And that's just one of your personal study questions to kind of answer on your own. But now I'm going to get right into it. All right, as always, I'm going to be using the Amplified Bible. If I need to, the 54 book complete Apocrypha, the Tanakh, which is in Hebrew, the Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus, which is, to me, one of the oldest sources of biblical knowledge because it was basically written before. And I'm going to go into some things tonight that, I don't know, I say tonight, today, that, maybe some of you knew, maybe some of you didn't know, but I think it'll kind of start to bring things into perspective, just about just breaking that cycle of just hearing something, believing it, and now it's the gospel. So let's get right into it. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is talk about God's commands, all right? God's command means God directly commanded somebody or us as people or us as human beings or certain individuals do certain things. So number one, be fruitful and multiply. That's Genesis 1:28. If I'm not mistaken, I believe That is the first commandment. So we're supposed to be fruitful, right? So anybody who says they don't want to have children, it ain't no way around it. That is not of God. All right. Anybody like be fruitful and multiply is God's first command. So we have to be able to understand that. Like these are from God to us. No interpreter, nobody in the middle to intercept that. Be fruitful and multiply. So that is a commandment of God. Number 2, do not eat or touch of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden. Okay, that's found in Genesis 3:3. Of course, that was given directly to Adam. But once again, we're talking about direct commands. Okay. And then last 3, do not have any other God before the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. / obedience. Direct instructions from God. Do not have a law associated with it. Do not have a sometimes a morality attached to it. It is just a God tell you to do something, you better do it. Because if you don't, we've seen multiple times in the Bible where disobedience gets people in trouble when it isn't necessarily a specific law or guideline to kind of steer us in the right direction. So obedience / disobedience, like I'll give you an example of obedience, right? Now, if you go back and look on the life of Saul was a good king. But if you look at what Saul did wrong in the eyes of God or in the eyes of the prophet who told him what to do, God gave a command. He basically told Saul to commit genocide. If you want to be all the way, that's what happened. He said, we need to go and destroy all of them. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was the Amalekites, right? And Saul didn't do it. And his kingdom and how he was perceived as a king and the things that started happening to him after he didn't do that take Saul's life in a completely different direction. You see what I'm saying? Because if you compare Saul to David, everybody will say, oh, well, Saul was wicked. Saul was evil. What really did Saul do that God was unpleased with? And displeased with? And the only thing that I can really think of, or the major thing that's talked about, I believe if you go to either Book of Samuel, Chronicles, Kings, you can get information about Saul. But for the most part, that was his biggest to me sin. Yeah, now we know later on he went and he spoke to the lady who was you're not supposed to talk to people who have who speak with familiar spirits and things like that. So we know he did sin and he committed other things. But at the same time, one of the biggest things that Saul did, and I think if I'm not mistaken, could be wrong, I ain't gonna even talk about that, but I believe the other thing he did was when he I think he murdered some prophets, but I'm not quite sure on that one, but I'll come back to that later. But just mainly one of the things where Saul kind of went off course is when he didn't basically just kill everybody in that one city. So just think about the price of disobedience. All right, now let's get into it. The law of Moses. All right, so basically talking about the Mosaic law. Now we have to understand that the Mosaic law starts with Moses after they've left Egypt, from Adam all the way down to Israel, Jacob, right? There isn't necessarily from biblical scripture a certain set of guidelines, except for basically thou shalt not have another God before thee and obedience. Those are pretty much the laws that are set in place, because if you look at what happened with Noah, what things were perceived as wickedness and all these other things. Now, there were some other immoralities going on, but for the most part, we don't really see like a guideline. We just knew what was righteous and what wasn't. Okay, so number one about the law of Moses, the Mosaic law established a priesthood through the tribe of Levi, starting with his brother Aaron. Okay, this was established by Moses, that basically said all priests should come out of the tribe of Levi. Okay, priests were given very specific instructions about their attire, marriage, duties, performing sacrifices, and building of the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. And that can be found in Leviticus 1-9 and Leviticus 21 and 22. Okay, so priests, they had very definable roles. And we can even see that when you dealt with the Ark of the Covenant, remember somebody who touched it who was not an ordained priest, he touched the Ark of the Covenant and he died, right? So we see these type of things happening to people who are not ordained in this Levitical priesthood, right? So there was a specific priesthood that was ordained by Moses, right? And we want to say that Moses was given it by God as well. I'm going to get a little bit into that as well, because when we talk about the law of Moses, we have to understand that God, we want to believe that God inspired it, right? But as far as like some of the laws that exist, in my opinion, once again, it's just my opinion. You can take that for the grain of salt that it is. But in my opinion, it's hard for me to believe that, God himself was saying, okay, if your oxen basically like would take his horns and gore another ox, then you need to repay that 5 times. The specifics of it, because you got to understand, we're talking about governance here. We're talking about a people, a group, eventually a kingdom that needed to be governed. So there are certain laws that govern every single aspect of society. Like here in the United States, we have laws that govern our society, criminal codes and things like that. You have to understand that Moses was basically doing the same thing from scratch. That's what he was creating, because after they came out of Egypt, they didn't have any sort of structure to basically live by. So that's basically what they were doing. The temple that Solomon built was the center of worship, okay? And we have that term temple. We don't have the term church yet. So we had those things going on. Shout out to my sister checking in as always. I appreciate it. Even early in the morning, appreciate you with a little huggy face. Tell the little homie I said what's going on. But this is a specifically dealing with the law of Moses as far as the priesthood is concerned. And the apostolic doctrine, the priesthood is no longer based on the lineage of Levi, starting with Christ. Okay, you got to remember, Christ, who was from the tribe of Judah, was not from the tribe of Levi. And this is where your priesthood originally came from. They came from the Levites. And I'm going to get into that, because the other thing we got to understand, when people say Jesus was a Jew, okay, we got to understand what that means. That means he was from the tribe of Judah. That's where that term Jew comes from, because when people who identify as being Jewish or Jews, they're basically saying their lineage of people comes out of the tribe of Judah. They're saying they're not Simeon, they're not Asher, they're none of the other 11, 12, 13 tribes, however you want to look at it. They are specifically saying they descend from a lineage of Judah, okay? And that's what needs to be understood. Terms like bishop, deacon, and pastor are also used for the first time, and that can be found in Ephesians 4:11, 1 Timothy 3 verses 1 through 2, and 1 Timothy 3 and 8. The concept of grace begins in John 1 through 16 verses 17, and the animal sacrifices come to an end. All right, the term church is used for the first time in Matthew 16:18. And once again, we're going to the Strong's, not the H, but we're going to the G this time. Strong's G 1577. And that is now in the Greek, because you got to remember, the oldest form of the New Testament that we have available is not written in the Hebrew or Aramaic. It is written in Greek. So we have to understand these things that start to come into play. Diet and alcohol. Okay, the law of Moses outlined a specific diet in Leviticus 11 and declares certain food unclean. Leviticus 10:9 outlaws priests to enter the tabernacle after drinking, and Numbers 6 and 3 forbids wine for a Nazirite for a specific period of time. Okay, switch over to the New Testament, or switch to what the apostles are preaching now. The apostolic doctrine says that all food is made clean by God. That is Acts 10:14 through 16. Titus 1 and 7 refers to a bishop not drinking wine. And Jesus said in Matthew 11:19 that he drank wine as well. So once again, we have to look at these differences. So when we talk about the diet and alcohol, why I know today some people will say like things, the term we use now is like halal, HALAL versus non-halal, things like that. So the diet that we have now, so if you are a Christian or you profess to be a Christian, then a lot of people will go to the New Testament and say, well, this is the reason why pork and shellfish and oil and all these other things that are originally considered to be unclean, this is the reason why we can eat them. And most people use Acts 10 verses 14 for that. In the Old Testament, there was a very specific thing of not eating things that were considered to be unclean. So we have to be able to understand, first of all, why did it change? Because remember, in Matthew, I believe Matthew 5 verses 17, Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill the law. So if Jesus followed the law, the Last Supper was Passover, so they were still recognizing the law at the time. They tried to catch Jesus doing work on the Sabbath, right? Which would have been breaking the law. And that's basically what his entire life is. So you have to ask yourself, why did these things change? Why was there a difference between what was going on at one group of period of time and what's going on at a different period of time? So the diet changed. Okay. And then alcohol became, like I said, it became a sin, because you also got to remember in the New Testament, it says, these shall not be made drunk with wine. But if you go through the Levitical law, getting drunk, if I'm not mistaken, you can go back and check it yourself, because once again, I always say I'm just here to be a guideline. But being drunk, because you got to remember, Noah was drunk. Now we remember what happened to Noah after he got drunk, but as far as Noah being a righteous man, the fact that he enjoyed the fruits of his grape after the flood didn't necessarily point out the fact that he sinned. So we can discuss that a little bit later, but let's keep going. Marriage. Okay, so in the Mosaic law, there outlines rules for polygamy in Deuteronomy 21 and 15, and the rules of marriage for the priesthood in Leviticus 21, 13, and 14. The priesthood were not allowed to marry anybody who was not a virgin. There are specific things, and there's also some things in there. Basically, the law concerning polygamy was not saying that you had to have multiple wives, or that you could, or whatever you want to look at it. It was just basically saying if you have two wives, one hated, one beloved, that the birthright will still go through the firstborn, regardless whether it comes through the beloved son, the wife of the beloved, or the wife of the hated. So that's basically the way that is. But we kind of see that birthright was kind of thrown off a little bit if we actually go back and look at Israel, because remember, Jacob married Leah first. Now, I'm not going to say Leah was a hated wife, but the birthright was supposed to pass through Reuben. It eventually didn't go through Reuben, because I believe Reuben was the firstborn. So it didn't go through Reuben, and the kingdom, or the king, the tribe of who was going to be like the royal line, actually went to Judah, but the birthright actually went to Joseph, and that could be found in, what was I reading? I believe in First Chronicles, where it actually talks about why, and the reason why Reuben had his birthright, I guess, stripped away is because he slept with one of Jacob's wives. But that's a different thing. In the Apostolic Doctrine, it introduces the concept of monogamy for the clergy. This is where a lot of people say one man to one wife. A bishop can only have one wife. There where these things come out, and that's in 1 Timothy 3:12, 1 Timothy 5:9, and 1 Timothy 3:2. So based on what we learn in the New Testament, based on what the disciples are saying, you have to understand the geography of what we're dealing with. If you go around and you look at the world, right? Let's just go and let's just expand our worldview for a while. As far as polygamy is concerned, you see it in just about every nation except for Europe. Okay. Europe was basically the only place that never really practiced polygamy. If you go to Asia, we saw it with the Khans, Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan, tons of wives. We saw it all throughout the Indian culture. They had, harems. We definitely know in the Islamic region, in the Middle East, as they call it, and all throughout Africa, we see it as well. But the only place that pretty much dealt with one wife for pretty much throughout existence would be Europe. And we can see that because there is not a tradition or a history of that in European culture. So if we look throughout history, we will not see a line of polygamy. So, but you also have to remember who was the church trying to influence or trying to convert. They were going into these places that were a little bit less familiar with their culture and their traditions. So that's marriage. Oh, let me go back here. Forgiveness of sin. All right. During the time of the Mosaic law, the children of Israel were commanded to bring a sin offering to a priest outlined in Leviticus 4. Okay. Now, if you kind of can look at that's kind of what the Catholic Church does somewhat, because they have a priest as an intermediary. Okay, you go into I'm not all the way as familiar with Catholic doctrine, but you go into a confessional booth and you confess your sins, and then I guess he'll say you say how many ever Hail Marys or whatever. That's what I heard. I'm not sure if that's correct. I'm not trying to come here to be an expert in Catholic doctrine, but you would basically, and it's very detailed, and it's outlined in Leviticus 4 about what to do for your sin offering. All right, and basically I put a picture of a barbecue because honestly, if we go back and look at uh the Levitical priesthood, which I always make a joke to kind of say, well, hey, that's how I know they was black, because if you even look at the priest, basically all the priest was doing was barbecuing all day, right? Because first of all, you couldn't put it on the altar if it wasn't seasoned. You understand what I'm saying? I ain't gonna make too many jokes, but if you look at it, honestly, you got to remember, like, what did that temple smell like? It had to smell like barbecue all day. Go back and read over, and when you talk about sacrificing, about how they take the bull and they tell you to take the shoulder off and put that part on, like, go back and actually read and get the animal sacrifice part kind of out of your brain, because some people look at that. I think Indiana Jones probably messed that up a little bit, but if you look at what they was really doing, they was basically just barbecuing. You understand what I'm saying? And they said, like, this was a sweet savor for a sweet aroma. I mean, argue what you want, but that's basically how sin was dealt with. In the Apostolic doctrine, it introduced that forgiveness of sin will now be accomplished through the blood of Christ. Okay, that can be found in Acts 5:30 and 32, Ephesians 1:7, and Colossians 1:14. Jesus died to take on the sins of everyone, right? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, right? And he was the perfect sacrifice for mankind. That's what we're taught, right? That's how sin is now taught, to ask for forgiveness. Jesus also said, no one can come to the Father except through me. So most of the time we pray, most of the time you say what? In Jesus' name I pray, right? That's how we go. We go through the Son to the Father. So the forgiveness of sin from what was going on in Israel kind of changed up a little bit as well. So yeah, sorry about that, but I guess I got a new message. So we got to think about even the forgiveness of sin changed. All right, heaven and the concept of the afterlife. If you look at during the Mosaic Law, if you look at the Old Testament, right, heaven is just seen as the sky, or it is just seen as where God dwells, right? The heavens. When it says the heavens are going to do something, the heavens will open up, it's most of the time referring to the sky. Heaven becomes a more concrete place in the Old Testament, and even the concept of the afterlife becomes a more concrete place in the New Testament versus the Old Testament, because you have to ask yourself, where did Noah go? We know when it said they would go sleep with their fathers, right? That's what we heard. That's what we heard a lot in the Old Testament. He went to sleep with his fathers. The term sleep was used. Okay. So when you even think about the concept of heaven, there really isn't an eternal resting place per se, right? Now we can go through some of the visions that we're seeing in Ezekiel and things like that, where they talked about the angels and they talked about this place. But as far as Moses or the prophet speaking of heaven as this place that we were really supposed to be going to, not necessarily. So the concept even of the afterlife, we really only can see it because even when Saul went to the necromancer to basically talk to the prophet, I believe it was Samuel, to basically pull up Samuel to ask him a question. It said he pulled him from Hades, right? Hades. So that term was one of the few times that term was used in the Old Testament, but you have to remember that this is what we have going on. It wasn't like David was like, oh, let me get my life together so I can go to heaven. Heaven is the streets being paved with gold and all those type of things. They come in later on, because just the heavens in the Old Testament versus the New become a completely different thing. So there's something to think about, but you also got to remember what other cultures were probably influencing that, because if you look throughout other cultures, especially Norse mythology, especially Greek mythology, especially the Greek mythology. Greek mythology has a very regimented, and so does Egyptian mythology as well. and you have to understand what cultures were surrounding Israel at the time. So Egyptian mythology has a very specific way of talking about the afterlife. Pan, well, no, that's Greek, but they had the concept of the underworld where Anubis dwell, and the scales weighing your heart to basically see if you live your heart on one side, I believe a feather on the other one, to basically see if you lived a just life and all those other things. Of course, with the Greeks, you got Hades, right, being the god of the underworld. You had Zeus living on Mount Olympus and things like that. And we had and then in the Norse ones, you had Thor, Odin, and then you had the different realms in between. And then basically, like, that's what gave the Vikings so much valor in battle, because they believe if you died, you would go to Valhalla and be given 70 virgins. So it's a lot of different things when you start to talk about this concept of the afterlife. Later on, when Islam was formed, that was another thing they talked about. You get 70 virgins, or you get virgins in the afterlife if you are killed in battle and things like that, or you're involved in the jihad, thing like that. So we got to understand where these concepts are coming from, because they're not necessarily coming directly from the Bible. They're not directly coming from God or the prophets or even Jesus himself. Now, Jesus talked about sitting on the right hand of the throne of God and things like that as well. But once you have to go back and explore, where does this concept actually come? And it's more similar to what some of the other cultures and traditions were doing. All right, so I want to give y'all a little second just to do a little quick Google break. I'm about to grab me a little swig of water real quick. And like I said, when I come back, I really just got maybe 2 more segments that I'm going to talk about briefly. And then we'll get into it.
Okay! Let's go. Okay! Let's go. Okay! Let's go. Let's go. Okay!
All right, I'm back. So let's just go ahead and get into these last one. Israelite, Jews, and Gentiles. Okay. Number one, from the Old Testament to the New, we have different terminology that is being used to describe groups of people, because even the Israelites themselves, I don't necessarily think they identified themselves as Israelites, right? Because we notice in Numbers, when they were numbering the people in First Chronicles, when it starts to give you, it talks about Gadites, talks about Reubenites, Benjamites, things like that. They were their own separate group of people. Yes, they were all under the Israel umbrella, but they were calling themselves different things. So we have Israelites who would have basically been when he was basically in Egypt trying to say, let my people go, and all those different things. We get that formation of the different groups once we leave Egypt. But just terms that are being used, the term Israelite is not really used in the New Testament as much. It wasn't used a lot in the Old Testament either, but what an Israelite is, or what an Israelite was, kind of changed, because even Jesus himself talks about Israel being a country, being a group of people, the house of Israel, right? So what does the house of Israel mean? Like, who would have all been in the house of Israel? So that's all his sons and everybody in that lineage. So that's the term Israelite. Okay. The term Jew, right? Now, first of all, we have to be able to understand where this term even comes from, because if you understand the Hebrew alphabet, okay, there is no J in the Hebrew alphabet. And you also have to understand that J, and you can Google this, is the newest letter in the Bible. I'm sorry, not in the Bible, this is in the English language, period. So it was adopted in the I believe in the 1500s, right? The letter J was then adopted into the English alphabet. So you can Google that on your own time. But the fact that the letter J didn't come around to the 1500 means that terms like Jesus, Jew, Joseph, John, all of these different things that are in the modern day, because the other thing is, until the 1600s, the name Jesus was not in the Bible. If I'm not mistaken, it was Iesus, I-E-S-U-S, which comes from the Greek, because the Greeks didn't have the letter J either. So that's when, you remember in one of my earlier teachings, I talked about from the Y to the J to the I-E, right? So Joseph You understand? Oh, I'm sorry, not Joseph, but Jesus would have been Jesus. Um, you know, Yahweh then became Jehovah, because then we put we took the J on it, changed the V, the W to a V, and that's how these things get changed. So you have to understand these terms that are being used. So if we look throughout the New Testament, we have terms like Jews, okay? And the term Jew basically meant he was a man descending from the tribe of Judah. That's the reason why when they said, basically called him the house of David, that's another term for somebody who was from the tribe of Judah, because that's the tribe where outside of Saul, because Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. We got to remember that he was not from the tribe of Judah, but everybody after Saul came from the tribe of Judah. Okay, so that's the reason why when Jesus, they called him house of David or son of David, they're still going to David, but that is where his line would have descended from the house of Judah. Okay, and Gentiles. Okay, Gentiles has been used to mean multiple different things, but a Gentile pretty much means anybody outside of Israel. Okay, and I know there are some identifying things. Me and my sister were talking about this a little bit, but it talks about the leaven of the Gentiles, right? And the leaven being yeast. Okay, yeast. So if you start thinking about who makes a lot of bread, that's another direction to point to who the Gentiles are, because if you want to even look at the concept of bread around the world, there's a certain group of people who eat a lot of bread or who have a lot of bread, and they use a lot of yeast and things like that. And then there's a group of people who use unleavened bread across the world. So it's just something just to be able to think about. Like I said, Israelites, Jews, Gentiles, we have to be able to understand these terms are modern day terms. Okay. And the last area I want to talk about is the role of women. The role of women changes drastically from during the time where the Mosaic law was, or the Old Testament, to the New Testament. You got to remember, Israel had a female leader, and some people could argue with that and say that, but I say no. In the book of Judges, Deborah, Deborah was definitely judging Israel at the time, and during the time of Judges, that is when technically the greatest warrior, that's where Gideon comes out, and a lot of these other great warriors come out. But during the time of Judges, the greatest warrior in the nation basically was the one who was picked to rule over the nation and judge over it, because it was a situation where with Deborah and Barak, where Barak didn't want to go to war if Deborah wasn't going to come with him. So if you look at the role of women, and what I mean by that is their influence, how they were able to influence very powerful men in the Bible. Remember, let's go all the way back to Abraham. Well, we can go back to Adam, but I'll just go to Abraham, because we all know Eve influenced Adam. But let's go back to Abraham. The whole situation where Sarah gives him her handmaid, they conceive a child, she starts feeling herself. Sarah comes to Abraham and says, hey, she got to go. Does Abraham say, I ain't listening to no woman? You understand? Hey, I'm the man of the house. I run this. You don't tell, hey, I'm going to have, he gave her some bread and a jug of water and said, hey, man, peace be with you. And they was up out of there. You understand what I'm saying? We see the influence that women have a lot stronger. There are books. We got the book of Ruth. We got the book of Esther. You understand? Books specifically talking about women, right? Specifically, the whole book is talking about women and the what women were doing, or what a specific woman was doing, but they have their own books dedicated, and that is only found in the Old Testament. You can remember with Bathsheba, her effect that she had on Solomon, right? When she wanted to go ask for the virgin that was talked about at the end of David's life, for, I think it was for one of the sons, could she be wed to that virgin? And Solomon took it as an insult, but he basically told his mother, you can have whatever you want. You understand what I'm saying? You got to remember, this is the reason why even you got to be able to look at the influence that women have. We all know what happened with Jezebel, right? The influence that she had. Now, that was a negative way. Delilah, negative way, but still the influence that women did have throughout the Old Testament, to me, was a lot bigger. Even going back to Rachel, and if you go back to Rachel and Leah and things like that, they seem to have a little bit, I don't want to say more control, but they didn't just seem to be like, shut off to the side somewhere and not really talked about. Because if you look at Mary in the Bible, she's not really talked about. She basically had the baby and is not really talked about, maybe a couple of times, but it's not like there's a lot of dialogue involving Mary speaking or involving what was Mary doing or how did Mary feel or what was going on. But we get a lot, in my opinion, a lot more closer look at the women in the Old Testament, because they're actually doing more action. They're actually doing some speaking. Like, remember when David came through, after he won a battle, he was dancing and his pants fell down, right? We know that his wife, Michal, the son of, I'm sorry, not the son, the daughter of Saul, was kind of upset, jealous, telling he looked like a fool. He was dancing, things like that, because it even went out the way to even mention how she was feeling. You understand what I'm saying? We knew what was going on more or less with these women. I mean, even with Potiphar's wife, you understand what I'm saying? Like, we get a more detail. In the New Testament, I mean, we don't know anything about it. I mean, you got to even look at like Mary's birth. We don't know anything about the birth. We know she had Jesus, right? But when Rebecca had Esau and Jacob, we knew that she was having issues with her pregnancy. Like, she said, oh man, something's going on. You understand? Like, we got more information about the women, honestly, so we could kind of care about them. And then I forgot her name, but there was also a prophetess, a female prophet in the Old Testament, but you don't hear anything about that in the New. So once again, you got to understand that even for women, the roles changed. And a lot of women can say, well, we got, hey, you got your one husband in the New Testament, things like that, which is fine. I'm not here to be a advocate for monogamy or polygamy. I'm just saying, we have to be able to understand. And the one thing I've said in multiple podcasts is God has never been the problem. It's always been man. Man has been telling us for generations, centuries, millennia about this is what we're supposed to be doing. This is what we're not supposed to be doing. This is what we're supposed to be doing. This is what we're not supposed to be doing. So at the end of the day, you're going to have to, you can figure those things out for yourself. But if you don't really take a step back and just look at the Bible, from things change drastically. And the one thing I'll tell you is Israel was a nation. And if you look at when Israel was really a nation, Israel wasn't around that long. You understand? Israel had a very short history. It's like they came out of Egypt, right? They had a couple of kings. Then they went into captivity. Then they came back. Then for about basically 2,000 years they were under Arab rule until basically the end of World War II. You understand what I'm saying? And that's when the state of Israel was formed. But I'm gonna get into that later. So I just want people to be able to understand there is it's drastic. It's not slight. It's not minor changes. It is doctrinal changes that should be changing the way you believe or don't believe. Because once again, if you were following something from the Old Testament, honestly, you can't follow that into the New Testament. They're not even a good mix. If you look at the Old Testament and New Testament, some things line up, some things don't. But once again, I talked about some of those things before, but I just want you to be even understand that's for the women. Things change for you based on what the Old Testament. You're supposed to, sit there in silence, be quiet. You understand what I'm saying? In the New Testament, that's that New Testament stuff. So you gotta, just take that with a grain of salt. All right, next time, man, I'm getting into the Vatican and the Catholic Church. All right, so I'm gonna discuss how the Bible, current church customs and traditions, all have their origin in the Catholic Church. Right? I'm gonna talk about the books that were excluded. I'm gonna talk about who decided Christ's divinity, because it wasn't God, as far as we know. When I say as far as we know, I mean as far as the church is concerned. It wasn't God who decided Christ, and it wasn't even Christ himself. I'll get into that the next time I'm on. I'm also going to talk about how did Europe go from polytheism to a monotheistic religion from a country that barely had a 500-year history. That's the one thing you got to do understand. That's why when people talk about Israel, Israel was never a great country. We need to stop trying to make it seem like Israel was this great nation that just it really was some nomads, living in that area of the Levant for about 500 to 1,000 years. They went down to Egypt, did some things. They came out, they formed a kingdom, because the kingdom of Israel did not last long, right? It did not. So you got to understand from a world perspective, there were other cultures and civilizations that were much more concrete, with historical records and pictures and art and culture and all these other different things that they had going for them. So the question, and the main question you have to ask yourself, is how did the entire world, how is 3 out of 4, 75% of the world under one umbrella of religion? And it all originates from one of the smallest areas, the smallest countries on the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about Emperor Constantine a little bit as well, because you have to be able to understand how did we go from Zeus and Thor and the Germanic people, and in Japan and China, they had their whole pantheon of gods. Everybody knows the Egyptian gods, Osiris, Anubis, and all those guys. How did we get to where we are now? And I'm going to discuss that, and we're also going to discuss why the Bible only has 66 books. We're going to discuss all of that, and that's going to be the next time. Once again, if you don't remember, you can contact me anytime at the Kung Fu Hebrew on Twitter, or whatever it is, on X now. I believe the last time I did it, it was still called Twitter. I don't think it's called that no more. You can follow Libre TV on YouTube. If you have any questions or you want me to answer something live on air, you can also email me at thekungfuhebrew.com. But yeah, until next time, man, I'll be back on camera next time. I just gotta do some things to get everything together. But until next time, man, hey, y'all be safe out there, and a big shalawamo to everybody.